Hey everybody, I think we are live here. I'm gonna just give it a couple more minutes to see if we get a few more people to join before I get started with this month's live horror stream. But we are live, talking about decades of horror here. And I got my drink in my, of course, mug here with all the classics, all the classic villains there. So yeah, we'll give it about 2 or 3 minutes here before we get into the nuts and bolts of this thing. I'm gonna pull up one particular decade here of movies that I want to have up on my phone. And then we'll get started. All right, one more minute here, and then I'll get started with the content of the live video here. All right, let's kick this thing off here. If people join, they join. So otherwise, of course, this will be up on my channel, posted video. So I thought we would talk about all the different decades of horror movies because they're quite um, they each kind of have their own stamp on the horror genre, in my opinion. Different themes, different subgenres of horror, in some decades more than others. Um, so I just thought it would be a good idea to come on here and go through each decade and talk about the ones that really stand out for me anyway, and for you. Um, could have some interaction here, and the ones that are a little bit less. I don't want to say like the worst decades because I don't think there's a bad decade of horror. I think there's just some decades that don't quite stand out as well. We'll get into all of that. So, um, first up, I think I'm just going to go back and kind of go through each of the decade and talk about the movies that stand out to me anyway in each of those decades. Of course, I didn't list all of them here because I'd have like 75 sheets printed off. And for some decades, I didn't need to write down any. Um, but I wanted to have some idea of certain decades of some of the movies and stuff that stand out. Either I own them or I've seen them, stuff like that. So let's just go ahead and go back to the 1920s, about 100 years ago, is really when horror kind of kicked off as far as horror movies go. Anyway, of course, there were books written and things for horror before that, but the 1920s is really where it all kind of started, and of course, we're in the 2020s now, so exactly 100 years. So, the three movies that stand out to me from the 1920s are The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, Nosferatu, of course, with the Max Schreck from 1922, and then The Hunchback of Notre Dame, however you want to say it, with Lon Chaney. Those are all from the 20s, and I would say of the three of them, Nosferatu is the one that really stands out the most. I don't, I'm not big into a lot of silent films, but that one works for me because of the visuals, because of the shadows, the camera work, just kind of everything about it. And of course, Max Schreck himself and just his look and everything is quite frightening. And of course, Nosferatu was a German release movie, and so is The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari as well. So that's kind of the 1920s. Of course, there's a lot of other silent movies, some of which I some of which I definitely want to watch. I haven't seen yet, but yeah, in the 1920s. So then we move on to the 1930s here, and there's a few more movies that stand out because this is really the decade where the Universal monster movies kicked off. Um, you have, of course, you have Dracula from 1931, directed by Todd Browning with Bela Lugosi. That one's always going to be the first one that stands out to me for the 1930s. You have Frankenstein with Boris Karloff. Those two I think really stand out for the 1930s, and they're both relatively early in the decade. And then you have other movies like Freaks by Todd Browning, which I do own a copy of. You have The Invisible Man with Claude Rains, The Black Cat with Boris Karloff, The Bride of Frankenstein, of course, with Boris Karloff. This was a big decade for Boris Karloff. The Wolf, no, sorry, that's we're going too far now with the next decade, but um, so that's the 1930s, and I would say of all those movies, I'd have to say Frankenstein's the one that really stands out here as far as being like the first movie that comes to mind. Dracula's right behind it, but Frankenstein, just because it was so um, just so iconic for that time, and it still holds up today and still talked about. So yeah, Frankenstein for the 1930s. Then we move on to the 1940s. And there's four movies that I put down for this decade that stand out. The Wolfman with Lon Chaney Jr., Frankenstein meets the Wolfman, House of Frankenstein, and Dead of Night. So you can see three of those four are still Universal monster movies or sequels to original Universal monster movies from the decade or two before. But Dead of Night is the first true horror anthology. So of course I had to list that in here from 1945. That's actually one of my favorites. And I'm not saying it just because it's the first one. I love Dead of Night with Mervyn Johns, and yeah, that's from the United Kingdom, of course. But The Wolfman, I would say, is of course the movie that really stands out aside from the anthology movie because it's another classic Universal monster movie. And then you get Frankenstein and the Wolfman in one movie. Um, so there was a lot going on with Universal monsters in the 30s and 40s here. So I would say for the 40s, yeah, the Wolfman's the one that's going to stand out for me. Then we go to the 1950s, and this is when things really start ratcheting up for horror. This is really the decade of, I would say, like the sci-fi horror. A lot of the uh, Attack of the Giant Ants or something, or you've got movies like Invasion of the Body Snatchers, House of Wax, The Black Scorpion, The Blob, The Fly. We're starting to get those creature feature kind of over the top 50 sci-fi horror movies here. Um, and you also have Creature from the Black Lagoon, which is yet another Universal monster movie. Probably one of my favorites, actually, with Richard Carlson. Creature from the Black Lagoon. Lagoon? Did I say Lagoon? Creature from the Black Lagoon. I just love that one. Though it's definitely a top 3 Universal horror movie for me. But yeah, there's a transition in the 50s, I would say, as far as the horror decade goes, where there's still some Universal stuff happening, still some sequels, but ultimately it's kind of working its way into more of the sci-fi horror. Vincent Price is really starting to make a name now with especially House of Wax in the early 50s. Kevin McCarthy with Invasion of the Body Snatchers, Steve McQueen with The Blob, and then the original Fly as well. Like, what have I got here? 4 of these 6 movies are considered sci-fi horror. So that's kind of where the 50s is known for. And I would say of these movies, I'd have to say Creature from the Black Lagoon is the one that stands out the most for me. Oh, shoot, I missed an important one. I Bury the Living as well, with Richard Boone, directed by Albert Band, I'm sorry. I absolutely love this movie, I Bury the Living. That would probably be 1B right behind Creature from the Black Lagoon, as far as the movies that stand out the most from that specific decade. So that's the 50s, and then we get into the 60s, and this is where horror really takes a big step up, I would say, because now we're getting out of the sort of the Universal monster and the the sci-fi horror, even though there's still a little bit of it yet. But we're starting to get into more what would be known as classic non-universal horror monsters. So I mean, you kick off the decade with movies like Black Sunday and Psycho right away, and Barbara Steele and Black Sunday, directed by Mario Bava, and of course Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho with Anthony Perkins and Janet Leigh, and you're already off to a tremendous start. And then you throw in movies like Carnival of Souls, which I absolutely love, Tales of Terror, an anthology with Vincent Price, Alfred Hitchcock's The Birds, Mario Bava's Black Sabbath. Mario Bava and Alfred Hitchcock kind of owned the 60s, at least the first part of it, as far as horror goes. The Haunting, Blood and Black Lace, Qui-Gon, which is an anthology movie from Japan that I just reviewed not too long ago. Dr. Terror's House of Horrors, Torture Garden, getting into the Amicus anthology movies. And then, of course, you end the decade with two absolute classic movies, Rosemary's Baby, directed by Roman Polanski with Mia Farrow, and, of course, Night of the Living Dead by George A. Romero. So, I mean, you can just tell right there, the 60s, we really got into more modern day horror, and it really, it was, a lot of it was a sign of the times too. It definitely had those themes of what was going on, especially with like Night of the Living Dead or even Rosemary's Baby. So yeah, as far as the 60s go, trying to pick one that stands out is really tough. But of course, I have to go with Psycho by Alfred Hitchcock from 1960. But it's very difficult though, because Carnival of Souls, I love. The Birds, I love. Black Sabbath, I love them all. Otherwise, I wouldn't have listed them here. But Psycho's the one that's, I think, at the top of the mountain there. If you want to say it's really like the first official slasher, even though a lot of people don't consider it a slasher. If you're looking at it in slasher terms, you could say that that's really the very first one. And then we get into the 70s, and I feel like the 60s really started the trajectory of horror, and the 70s just continued it. You open with movies like Tales from the Crypt and The Exorcist, the Wicker Man in the early 70s. And then, of course, you have my favorite slasher of all time, Black Christmas by Bob Clark, with Olivia Hussey and Margot Kidder. The Texas Chainsaw Massacre. And if we haven't gone up the mountain high enough, then you follow that up the next year with Jaws from 1975. I mean, it's a who's who of horror movies for the decade of the 70s. And it's another decade where horror was getting a lot more darker, a lot more violent. There were movies here I didn't even list, like Last House on the Left and The Hills Have Eyes as well, where violence is becoming more of a thing on screen. And again, it's kind of a sign of the times, just like the 60s was, frankly. So those are all the movies I listed. Now I'm going to just do the next few decades, either by my phone or off the top of my head. So, of course, the next decade. Oh, I didn't give a movie for the 70s, did I? Oh, boy. You could pick any one of these, frankly. It's between, well, no, it isn't. I guess I'll have to go with The Exorcist, but you could easily go with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre or Jaws or Black Christmas, any of them really. But I would say The Exorcist just because it's so iconic. A lot of people that saw it at the time had to walk out and were throwing up and all kinds of stuff. So that in itself, I think, has to make it the movie of the movies from the 70s. So then we get on to the best decade of horror, of course, in my opinion, and that's the 1980s. And this is the decade that's known for the slasher movies. But there's so many other great movies besides that. And if you stay tuned to my channel, you're going to see that I'm going to start delving into this decade very soon. I don't want to give too much away, but stay tuned. Yeah, the slasher movies, but then, of course, you have movies like The Fog, you have The Changeling, just two tremendous ghost stories. The Shining, of course. What can you say about that? But it's a decade that's really best defined by the slasher movies, the Halloween sequels, Friday the 13th. I just realized I didn't even mention Halloween with the 70s. Shame on me. Wow, how did I not put that down? I don't know. That might actually have to go ahead of The Exorcist as far as the movie that stands out, but just wanted to throw that in there. But yeah, as far as the 80s go, Halloween slashers, Friday the 13th, Nightmare on Elm Street, the big three, Child's Play to join the party later in the decade. But it's the slashers. It's, I could just go through a list of slashers for the decade. My Bloody Valentine. Um, then you have movies like Creepshow, great anthology. You have The Evil Dead, one of the scariest movies, in my opinion, from the 80s, the original. You have Reanimator. You have, oh God, I could just go on and on. Chopping Mall. You have, where do I end? It's a tremendous decade. And for me to pick a movie from the 1980s, I'm going to have to go with The Shining. Um, I just, the book, the movie, they're both fantastic, even though they're different. And to me, in my opinion, that's the movie that really got me interested in horror for the long haul. So even though other people would probably pick different movies, for me, it's definitely The Shining. Tremendous decade of horror. So I kind of see like the 60s and building, the 70s building, the 80s building, and then the 90s it kind of goes like this. I'm not going to say the 90s is a bad decade of horror, but it definitely came back down to earth after the last 3 decades. It's kind of like comparing Pocahontas to Following the Lion King if you're a Disney fan. It's not that Pocahontas is a bad movie. It's just that in comparison to what came before it, it just doesn't hold a candle. And that's kind of how I view the 1990s. That being said, it doesn't mean the 90s doesn't have classic, iconic horror movies. You got The Silence of the Lambs, Candyman, The People Under the Stairs, Body Bags, which is a great anthology, Wes Craven's New Nightmare, Seven with Brad Pitt and Morgan Freeman. And then, of course, in the second half of the 90s, it was the reinvention of the slasher movie. So reinventing the slasher movie with those late 90s vibes and the meta-ness that was involved in it, the self-awareness. And of course, no movie franchise did that better than Scream did from 1996. And, other ones like I Know What You Did Last Summer and Urban Legend. Yeah, that's kind of how I would view the second half of the 90s, is just the reimagining, if you will, the reinvention of the slashers from the 80s. Because the 80s, like the slashers, I would say the first 5 or 6 years were really strong, and then there's still some good ones. I didn't even mention Intruder from 1989, but then they kind of went away for a while in the 90s, in the first part of the 90s, and then, as I said, they came back with Scream, I Know What You Did Last Summer, and just a host of other ones. So I wouldn't say the 90s definitely isn't a bad decade, but it is a step down, in my opinion, overall from the previous 3 decades, but still very good. And then we get into the 2000s, and this is a decade I have my share of fun with as far as over CGI. This is where the jump scares really started to become a thing. But that being said, the 2000s has some tremendous horror movies. I mean, you kick off the Final Destination franchise in 2000. Though I missed the Blair Witch Project as well in the late 90s, and what's the one with Bruce Willis and the kid? Oh my God, The Sixth Sense. That's it. So yeah, I guess that props the 90s up a little bit more with those. Yeah, thank you, Joey. The Sixth Sense, which is a great horror movie too, from the 99, and so was the Blair Witch Project. So, but as far as the 2000s go, you have Final Destination. That franchise kicks off. Of course, Saw kicked off. There was a decade that really is kind of defined by the I know some people don't like the term, but torture porn. With Saw and Hostel and a number of other movies. You've got some great movies in the 2000s. The Ring from 2002, which I still think is one of the creepier movies of all time, even though it's PG-13. You got The Descent from 2005, which is a phenomenal movie. What am I missing here? There's other 2000s movies. American Psycho from 2000, of course. Um, yeah, there's that. You got to give the 2000s its credit. I mean, it definitely has its share of that. We also started seeing remakes towards the latter part of the 2000s as well, with Texas Chainsaw Massacre remake and The Hills Have Eyes remake, um, the Black Christmas remake. Um, yeah, that's all from 2000. And then to close out the decade, you have movies like Orphan, which I really like from 2009. You have um, Blood Creek. You have sorry, I'm having to sort of just kind of go through my phone quick here. Dead Snow, The Descent 2, even though I've never seen it. Um, the Friday the 13th remake. It's all about remakes. Yes, and I agree, Joey. Jump scares were a huge. I feel like the 2000s were really where the jump scares became a thing because I didn't notice them. I mean, you could find movies from before the 90s that had jump scares in them, even Scream. But I feel like the 2000s they really like perfected the jump scare as well as sometimes being a little too over CGI'd and less practical effects, which is a big no-no for me. Um, but I would say the 2000s is it's a pretty solid decade of horror movies, really. There's definitely some really good ones. And then finally we're going to talk about the 2010s. I'm not going to talk about the 2020s because we're only 4 years into that. But the 2010s is kind of known as, and I'm going to change the term because I hate this fucking term, which is elevated horror. I'm not going to call it that. I'm going to call it art house horror from now on, especially the second half of the 2010s. So movies like Hereditary and Midsommar and The Witch and what's the one that really kicked It Follows and all those kind of movies that are a little bit more. They're not this just surface level horror. There's a little bit more there than just visceral scares on the screen. And there, some very good ones. I mean, I don't like all of those that I just mentioned. I need to watch It Follows again because that really didn't blow my skirt up too much the first time I watched it. I mean, it's good, but that might have been one that was a little too hyped up for me too. But I know there's other ones too that I'm forgetting about from the 2010s. Um, oh, the Conjuring franchise got started in the 2010s, and the first two Conjuring movies are very good. Insidious got started in 2010, and a few of those movies are pretty good for being PG-13. Sinister, which is another movie I need to rewatch because I've only seen it once. It Follows, as I mentioned, The Witch, um, Terrifier, the first one. Yeah, I mean it's another decade that's really defined by its own subgenre, if you will, and that's kind of how I remember the 2010s. I don't really know what the book will be on the 2020s yet. At the end of the day, we'll have to see. But there's some decent movies so far in the 2020s, I would say. Um, but um, yeah, so that's kind of going through the decades, and now I'm going to talk about each decade, how I would rank them, the last 10 decades in terms of my order of favorite decades. And I'll probably go with the 1920s first, or number 10, 9 or 10, whatever you want to call it. And a lot of that's just because I haven't seen a lot of the silent horror movies other than Nosferatu and The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which are very good. Um, but I haven't seen any of the other ones. So to be fair, I'd have to start there. And then I'd probably go with the 1940s after that. I mean, you have The Wolfman and Dead of Night, and some other good ones, the sequels to the Universal Monster movies. Um, then I'd probably go with the 50s, and that's only because I haven't seen a lot of the sci-fi horror movies. I have some of them in my collection, and they're on my list. I just have to watch them yet. So that could definitely go higher at some point. Then I'd probably go with the 30s, I suppose. After that, the invention of the Universal monster movies with Dracula, Frankenstein, and so on. Um, Then I would go the 90s after that. There, like I said, there are some really good horror movies, some defining horror movies in the 1990s, but it's just not quite as strong as what my top four is going to be. Five. Wait a minute. I have to do math on a Friday night, and that's not good. I'm an accountant all week, so I need to be done with the math. But well, anyway, so yeah, the 90s would be number 5 or 6, whatever it is. And then I'd probably, so now we're down to the 60s, 70s, 80s, 2000s, and 2010s. I'd probably go 2010s next. Then I'd probably go 2000s after that, kind of in reverse order. So 2010s would be 5, 2000s would be 4. And then this is where it really gets tough, my top 3, but I'm going to go with the 60s as number 3. Just a tremendous decade of horror, so many classics. Then I'm going to go with the 70s at number 2. Again, just builds on the 60s, so many classics. But of course, for me, oh, Joey, sorry, I think you came late to the party. I actually went through all the decades, starting with the 1920s through the 2010s. So, yeah, I love the 60s, though. As far as horror movies go, you got Black Sunday, Psycho, Carnival of Souls, Tales of Terror, The Birds, Black Sabbath, The Haunting, Blood and Black Lace, Qui-Gon, Torture Garden, Night of the Living Dead. I mean, do I need to go on, really? It's just, it's a who's who of classic horror movies. Yeah, definitely jump into the 60s. I would say start with Black Sunday or Psycho, which are the two that kind of kick off the decade. And then, like I said, there's just so many great original horror movies during that decade. And it came very close to being number 2, but I can't put it above the 70s because the 70s has The Exorcist, The Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and Jaws, 3 of the greatest horror movies that anybody's going to know of all time. And then it has my personal favorite slasher movie, which is The Black Christmas by Bob Clark. So I mean, I really can't put the 60s in front of the 70s, but the top 3 decades are all just iconic for me. And then, of course, the 1980s is going to be number 1. No surprise. If you know me or if you followed my channel, the slasher movies, even the ghost movies like The Changeling and The Fog and The Shining, of course, which I keep coming back to. I didn't even mention maybe the greatest horror movie of all time, The Thing. John Carpenter's The Thing from 1982. Then you have one of the greatest horror anthology movies in Creepshow. You have some great Stephen King movies like Christine from 1983, Cujo. What's the one that I'm Firestarter. Yeah, late 70s, early 80s. That's about as good as it gets right there. There's like 8 consecutive seasons, 8 consecutive years there of just nonstop classic horror movies from like, pick a year, 75, 76 to 84, basically. I agree with you, William. It's a who's who of the best horror movies of all time. But yeah, I'm in love with the 80s. What can I say? And a lot of it's nostalgia. I mean, even though I was born in 78, so I didn't actually watch a lot of the movies live when they came out because I would have only been 2 or 3 or 4 years old. Just going back and watching, I just kind of like everything about them. From the cheesiness of it, the look of them, just kind of everything about it. I mean, it was just a time like no other decade. And that's why it's my favorite. Now, if you guys that are on the chat want to go ahead and put what your favorite decade is down below in the comments, you can. But that's kind of my rundown of the 10 decades there, 1920s through 2010s, not including the 2020s yet. But yeah, trying to think if there's anything else I want to say. 80s overall, yeah, it's hard to argue with the 80s, especially if you were somebody that was born before the 80s. I just think that most people that were born anywhere between like the 50s and the 70s and into the and there are even people after that. I mean, I know there's people that are younger than me that love the 80s. Um, yeah, what will the future of horror will be? Yeah, that's what's exciting. We don't know. I mean, I'm guessing we're probably going to get probably more art house. That's the term now, art house horror on my channel, not that E word. Um, we'll probably get more of those kind of movies going forward. Um, but it's exciting to kind of see where it goes. I'm not one of those people that hate everything that comes out now. I mean, I definitely weed through the movies that come out. Now, I don't love everything. I wasn't a huge fan of Midsommar. I haven't seen Hereditary yet. I did like The Witch. I liked The Babadook well enough for a one-time watch for what it was. I need to watch It Follows again. So some of them are kind of hit or miss, but I kind of consider myself a horror aficionado in terms of respecting and giving all decades, all aspects of horror, all subgenres of horror an equal and fair shot, and not just pigeonholing myself to just slashers or just ghost haunted house kind of movies. I think that there's a lot of room in the horror community for all kinds of ideas and great horror movies. I will say that for all the horror movie makers out there, stick with practical effects, please. Especially if you're doing like creature features and slashers and gore kind of movies, torture porn movies. The CGI, I'm over it, man. There's some of it that's done better nowadays than what it was like in the 90s and 2000s, but still, I would prefer practical effects. Night of the Living Dead 68 and Texas Chainsaw Massacre 74 are my all-time favorites, but the 80s had some. Yeah, it's hard to argue with either of those. I mean, I could have easily said the movie of the 70s is a Texas Chainsaw. That's how you know you have a good decade, when you can look at it and there's like, it's just a who's who of horror movies. Like the 60s, 70s, and 80s, I could have picked 5 or 6 different movies that stood out above the others, but I couldn't because they don't stand out above the others. They're all on an equal playing field, frankly, and that's why those 3 decades are the strongest to me. Not to take away from anything that came before the 60s or after the 80s, because I have movies that I love in every single decade. But I think it's all about respecting the horror genre and all its history and everything. That's what I'm trying to get more into. I didn't really talk about Giallo, but that became a thing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and then kind of died out in the 90s a little bit. Yeah, Maniac from 1980. I didn't even mention that one. It's another great slasher movie. I mean, I could do one of these live videos just on slasher movies, mostly from the 80s, but some other slasher movies as well. And maybe that'll be my next live video stream for May. Yeah, I love Maniacs. Definitely stay tuned to my channel, William, because if you like the 80s, you're going to like what I have coming up here. I'm going to really delve into the 1980s horror here as early as May. So stay tuned for that. But yeah, I'm trying to think. I don't think I have too much else to say. I am curious where horror is going to go overall the rest of this decade and beyond. It feels to me like horror is becoming a little bit more mainstream than it used to be. I know part of that is the art house kind of horror movies where they make it a little bit more mainstream that more people can relate to than the old hack and slash. And I think there's a place for that, as long as they don't just stop with the term, though. That term came from an outside the horror person, clearly probably a critic or something that hated horror movies 30 years ago. But now they respect them because they have deeper meanings in them. So, yeah, with that being said, I think I'm probably, unless anybody in the chat wants to talk about anything else in any other decades, I think I'm probably going to wrap this up around the 35, 40-minute mark. We're about 33 minutes in right now. But yeah, I'm excited to dive into different decades that I haven't really spent a lot of time in. The 20s, the 50s, a little bit of the 90s and the 2000s yet even, and a couple in the 2010s that I haven't seen yet. But I just don't think you can go wrong with those 3 decades that I highlighted here. I really don't. So with that being said, yeah, I don't have too much else to say about horror decades. Hopefully we have a lot more to go. another 100 years of great horror movies throughout the decades. But I won't be here for all 100, but for my children and my children's children. Hopefully that'll be the case. So with that being said, my goal for these live video streams are I need to invest in a screen recorder, because I want to do some going forward. I want to do some of those what do you call them, where you like group different movies in different categories. Oh my god, I'm drawing a blank. It's late. It's Friday night. It's not that late, but I'm in my 40s, so it is for me. Um, Tier lists. Ugh, I don't know why that was such a hard get there, but for like tier list rankings and things like that. So I am looking into that. Hopefully, by the time I have my May video up live, I'll have a screen recorder. That'll help too with the overall picture of my live video streams for those that watch it after the fact and want to see everything and how it all went down at the time it was live. So with that being said, stay tuned for my channel. Of course, I'm in the middle of my um, Evil Dead franchise. One movie left, plus a documentary, plus my ranking. And then, like I said, if you're into the '80s, stay tuned, because I've got some great content that we're really going to delve into to the movies. So, yep, you have a great night too, William, and anybody else that's on the chat. Joey, thank you for checking in. And anybody else that's not on the chat but checked out my live stream, I really appreciate it. Hope you're all doing well. I think I'm going to go watch a horror movie now, maybe Friday the 13th, to prepare for what I have coming up in May. So, with that being said, I'm going to go ahead and sign off here. Everybody have a good night and stay scared. Bye.